right, so you know that feeling, right, where you sit down and like, today's the day I'm going to get those taxes done.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to get them done. But then, like, you know, you just do a quick check of social media and an hour goes by, you're scrolling through endless posts, a friend sends a video, and then you're down a rabbit hole of related videos.
Happens to the best of us.
Yeah. And all of a sudden 3 hours are gone and those taxes are still sitting there untouched. You know,
right, just poof.
Your focus just disappeared.
It's crazy how much that's become like a universal experience, and I think it speaks to less about us as individuals and more about the environment that we're having to navigate.
That's a great point.
And that's exactly what we're going to be deep diving into today, this whole idea of what's the science behind this shrinking attention span that we seem to be experiencing in the digital age.
Yeah.
And our guide through this is going to be the work of Gloria Mark and her really insightful book, Attention Span.
Perfect. And you, our listener, you want to get the core knowledge. You don't want to be bogged down with like tons and tons of details. So this is perfect for you.
Yeah.
We're going to pull out the most important findings and the aha moments from her work and also from her own journey of research.
Yeah, Gloria Mark, she brings such an interesting background to this topic.
Yeah.
Because she didn't start in cognitive psychology.
Oh, really?
Her initial interest was actually in art and that process of discovery.
Yeah.
And then that led her to cognitive psychology. And then amazingly, this was at a company, EDS, which was affiliated with MIT.
Wow.
Right at the cusp of when networked computers were just becoming a thing.
I see.
So imagine being in those early meetings, you know, seeing how this technology was being integrated into business. And she's talked about how it felt like stepping into the future. And as a psychologist, she was there to observe how people were actually using these brand new tools in the real world.
I bet.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So it's a really interesting perspective that she brings to this.
So what we're going to be talking about today, the aim is pretty straightforward. We want to help you understand why it feels so hard to stay focused when we're using our devices.
Yeah.
What is it that makes distractions so prevalent, and why does our attention just seem to flit around so much when we're online?
Yeah, and that actually brings up a super important point, which Gloria Mark emphasizes over and over again, and that is that awareness is the foundation.
I see.
Like, just understanding the forces that are at play that are influencing our behavior is that first step towards actually making a change.
Yeah.
So once we understand the reasons behind those tendencies, you know, why am I always reaching for my phone? Then we can start to develop agency, like that feeling of, okay, I'm in control of my attention.
Okay.
And we can start to make more conscious choices about how we engage with technology.
So let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
Let's talk about this declining attention span that we have. What does the data tell us?
Yeah, so the central finding, and this is shown over and over again in Gloria Mark's research and in the work of others, is that the average time that we spend looking at a screen before our attention shifts has declined pretty dramatically over the years.
Wow. Okay, well, give us a sense of those numbers. Like, how much of a shift are we talking about?
So back in 2004, when she was doing some of her initial research, the average attention span on a computer screen was around 150 seconds, so 2.5 minutes.
Okay.
By 2012, that average had dropped to 75 seconds.
Half?
Yeah, and then from 2016 to 2021, multiple studies, including her ongoing work things for Microsoft research student projects, all consistently finding that the average time spent on any screen before a switch was 44 to 50 seconds.
So less than a minute.
Yeah, less than a minute. So
That's puts it in perspective.
yeah, it does. And, you know, it sort of aligns with our own lived experience, right? Like we're experiencing that. Interestingly, she notes that in 2016, the median attention duration was even lower at 40 seconds. So that means in half the instances, people's attention on a screen lasted less than 40 seconds before they switched.
And it's not as if we're using technology less overall, right?
Absolutely not.
It's more.
In fact, she points to something as simple as email as an example.
Wow.
So in 2004, the average daily time spent on email was 47 minutes.
Okay.
By 2016, it had almost doubled to 83 minutes.
Wow.
And, you know, that doesn't even account for all the other messaging platforms, Slack and, you know, texting and all of that.
All different apps.
All the different apps, which are probably adding even more to that daily digital engagement, often in these really short bursts.
So we're switching faster, we're switching more often, and we're spending more total time in this digital world.
That's exactly right.
So what is it that's causing this rapid shifting? And, you know, there's a specific term she uses for it, doesn't she?
She coined the term kinetic attention to describe this.
I like that.
Fast-paced and really dynamic way that we move our focus between applications and social media websites, even between our computers and our phones.
Right.
It's this constant attentional motion.
Okay.
And it's important to emphasize that she points out these shifts. They're not always conscious choices.
Right.
So kinetic attention can be purposeful. If you're actively researching something, you're going between different sources, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But it can also be very chaotic, and it can be triggered by external stimuli, like that buzz of a notification, or even more surprisingly, by internal factors. So a random thought pops into your head, you suddenly have the urge to check social media, and boom, off you go.
It's like our brain is constantly looking for the next interesting thing, whether it's out there or in our own mind.
I think that's a great way to think about it, yeah. And a big piece of this is automatic processing.
Okay.
Those reactions that we have to things like notifications, they've become almost reflexive.
Yeah.
They're quick, they feel effortless, and they're largely happening outside of our conscious control.
Right.
She makes an interesting comparison to the effects of alcohol.
Oh.
So while alcohol impairs our controlled processing, that sort of top-down executive function, it actually has minimal effect on these automatic responses. So, if you've had a drink or two, you're probably still going to reach for your phone when it makes a sound.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
So it really highlights how ingrained some of these behaviors are.
Yeah. Well, and she talks about how difficult it is to resist these automatic urges.
Yeah, absolutely. And she uses the classic Stroop color and word test as a really good illustration of this.
Okay.
So for those who don't know, in this test, you see words that are printed in different colors, and sometimes the word matches the color, like the word green in green ink, but other times it doesn't. So the word green in red ink.
I see.
And you're asked to name the color of the ink. And it's harder than you think because you have that automatic response to just read the word.
Yeah.
You have to suppress that in order to focus on the color.
So it's that battle between those two.
Yeah, that automatic and that more controlled response.
Okay.
And she makes the link to our digital environments. So if you think about your computer screen, right, that's your central hub.
Yeah.
You might be trying to concentrate on a document, but your browser tabs, your email alerts, those are all pathways that lead to something that's way more instantly gratifying.
It's so true.
Right. And resisting the urge to click on those things requires, that self-regulation, that effort to override those automatic responses.
Right.
And, this gets even more challenging as these actions become more ingrained as habits.
Right. It's like a muscle memory almost.
Yeah.
So it's not just those external things like those notifications. It's those internal things.
Yeah.
It's our own thoughts. And she delves into mind wandering quite a bit, doesn't she?
She does, yeah. Mind wandering, that internal focus of our attention, is super common.
Right.
And she actually cites research that suggests that they can occupy anywhere from 25 to 50% of our waking hours.
Wow.
Which, our minds are natural explorers.
Yeah.
So that's not necessarily a bad thing in itself.
Right, exactly.
And she points that out, she says that mind wandering can actually be beneficial.
Oh.
It's a low effort way for our attention to be engaged.
I see.
And it can even replenish cognitive resources, and it can also foster creativity because when our thoughts are less constrained, we make unexpected connections.
So then what happens when our devices and the internet enter the picture?
That's when things get really interesting because, the way that our devices and the internet itself are designed, they actually facilitate this mental drift. So those visual cues of our apps, our browser tabs, those can easily hijack our mind. Even just the presence of our phone or our computer can act as that trigger.
Right.
And then the internet structure itself, with its interconnected links and nodes, it sort of mirrors this wandering pattern of our mind.
Yes.
So you can start out reading a Wikipedia article on, the French Revolution, and then through a series of links, find yourself learning about, the history of bread making in medieval Europe.
It's so true. It's so easy to just jump from one thing to another. Like the whole online experience is designed to kind of help us pinball around.
I think that's a really good point. It's almost like it's designed for that, and this ease of navigating between all these topics contributes to what Gloria Mark calls the second framing error, and that is our tendency to really misjudge how much time we'll actually spend online.
Yeah.
So we go in with the intention of, I just need to look up this one thing, but then we get absorbed, and all of a sudden time has just vanished.
Oh, yeah. I do that all the time.
Yeah, it's easy to do.
Okay, so this is where executive control comes in, right? That part of our brain that helps us to stay focused.
Right, that mental discipline and, strong executive control can help us stay on those external tasks and resist the pull of mind wandering. However, its effectiveness wanes when the task at hand isn't super engaging or when our cognitive resources are depleted.
When we're tired.
When we're tired, exactly. And then those easy, low-effort activities become much more alluring.
Right, you don't have the energy to resist.
Yeah, you don't have the willpower. And she also talks about this idea of sunk costs in the digital world, which I think is really fascinating.
Oh, yeah?
It's like that feeling of you've already invested time in something, even though it's turned out to be not super rewarding, but you feel like you need to continue because you don't want that initial investment to feel wasted.
I see.
So you keep scrolling through, a boring social media feed, hoping to find something interesting.
Yeah.
Even though, you'd probably be better off doing something else.
Right. Like maybe I should just close this app.
Yeah, exactly. But there's that feeling of, well, I've already put in 5 minutes.
Okay. So we're constantly shifting our attention, often driven by habit, external stimuli, or our own mind-wandering thoughts. And the internet is kind of designed to make that easier.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, we've got multitasking going on.
Yeah.
Which I think everybody does, or at least we think we do.
We like to think so.
What does the research tell us about how prevalent it is and what the real costs are?
Yeah. So multitasking in the context of our digital lives, it's pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
And Gloria Mark points out that the groundwork for this type of behavior is laid down pretty early on.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so children as young as 2 to 4 years old are averaging 2.5 hours of screen time a day.
Wow.
And that increases to over 3 hours a day for kids aged 5 to 8.
That seems like a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot, and it might be mostly passive viewing at those ages, but it normalizes this idea of extended periods in front of screens from a really young age.
Yeah.
And importantly for young children, their self-control and executive functions are still developing.
So they're even more susceptible.
They're even more susceptible to distractions. So
Yeah.
It's a really important consideration.
Well, so what are the downsides then of this multitasking? Like, what does the research actually tell us of the cost of this?
Well, the costs are actually pretty substantial, and they affect us on multiple levels. So the first thing is that multitasking induces stress. And the science behind this is really consistent. So we know that blood pressure tends to rise, heart rate increases, and even our immune system can be negatively affected.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this sort of mirrors our own subjective feeling of being more stressed when we're trying to juggle all these things.
Right. It's that overwhelmed feeling that we all get.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of what's called attention residue.
Okay.
So when you switch from one task to another, often your mind is still lingering on that previous task.
Okay.
And those lingering thoughts can actually interfere with your focus on that current one.
I see.
It's like, you're trying to focus on a new conversation, but you're still replaying that argument you just had in your head.
Yeah, I've totally done that.
Yeah, it's hard to really fully switch gears.
Yeah.
And then probably one of the most significant costs of this is the depletion of our limited attentional capacity, so our cognitive resources.
Okay.
And Gloria Mark uses the analogy of a leaky tank. So the more we multitask, the more we switch our attention, the less fuel we have available to actually engage in meaningful work. And studies in real-world work environments have also shown that the more attention switches a person makes, the lower their end-of-day assessed productivity.
So even though it feels like you're getting more done because you're doing a lot of things,
Right.
it's actually making you less productive.
Exactly. And more stressed. And research using something called the NASA Task Load Index, or NASA TLX, which is a way of measuring perceived mental workload, has consistently shown that multitasking is associated with higher levels of mental workload, frustration, time pressure, effort, and stress.
Yeah, it's not worth it.
And despite all this rapid switching, she points out that the average duration of our attention on any single screen has remained relatively stable around 47 seconds.
So it's just bouncing around a lot.
Bouncing around a lot, not really settling in, and it's not just switching between individual tasks either. She and her colleagues have looked at switching between working spheres, so different projects or areas of work, and they found that people are averaging over 12 of these shifts per day, with an average duration of only 10 minutes and 29 seconds spent in each sphere before moving on.
12 different working spheres in a day. That sounds incredibly fragmented.
Yeah, it really is. And, in their studies, participants themselves, they described these shifts, slipping back and forth between work mode and distraction mode.
Right.
Even using terms like snacking on social media or going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So we're constantly being pulled in different directions by things that are happening around us and by those internal urges.
Right. So let's talk about interruptions, because she makes this distinction between external and internal interruptions.
Yeah, so the external interruptions, those are kind of the ones we think about, the colleagues stopping by your workspace, a notification popping up on your screen, your phone rings.
Right.
But what's so interesting is that her research has revealed this really important finding. we're nearly as likely to interrupt ourselves.
Oh, really?
Due to our own internal triggers.
Wow. So we're our own worst enemy.
It seems like in a random thought, a sudden urge to check something, a habitual glance at our email.
So that is eye-opening. We're our biggest distraction ourselves.
Yeah, it really is. And she uses a really good analogy to kind of illustrate the impact of external interruptions.
Okay.
It's like going from driving on a quiet country road to suddenly being on a busy highway.
Yeah.
Right? You have to be constantly reacting to all these other drivers.
Right.
And similarly, when we face interruptions, our cognitive processes, even our goals, can get temporarily derailed.
Right, because that interruption becomes the focus.
Exactly. And as she connects it to the work of Bluma Zagarnik,
Yeah.
we tend to remember those tasks that are interrupted or left unfinished, even if they're minor things. So our primary goal, can kind of get lost amidst this mental clutter of all these unresolved interruptions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, she also mentions a very unexpected finding about interruptions and how quickly we complete tasks.
Yes, in some of her studies, she found that interruptions, whether they were related to the task at hand or not, could actually lead people to complete an email task more quickly than if they hadn't been interrupted.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they tended to use fewer words in their replies when they were interrupted.
Okay.
But there was no decrease in politeness or accuracy.
That does make sense. Why would that be?
Well, the hypothesis is that when people are interrupted frequently, they might actually proactively work faster to compensate for the time they anticipate losing to those interruptions.
Oh, that's interesting. So they're like almost rushing because they're expecting another interruption?
Yeah, and they also tend to resume tasks more quickly after they've experienced interruptions.
Interesting, but I bet there's a trade-off for that.
There absolutely is. So using the NASA TLX, she found that while interruptions might lead to faster task completion in some instances, they also resulted in significantly higher reported mental workload frustration, time pressure effort, and stress.
Yeah.
So experiencing this day after day can take a real toll.
This makes me think about email because it's a constant barrage of these little interruptions. And she did an experiment about this, didn't she?
She did one of her most insightful studies involved what they called an email cutoff.
Okay.
So participants had their email access blocked for an entire week.
Wow.
They could still communicate with colleagues by, meetings or phone calls.
Okay.
And initially, they still felt that habitual urge to check email, but that gradually diminished throughout the week. The results were pretty significant. So when email was blocked, people's attention spans while they were working on their computers were noticeably longer.
Really?
Yeah, they were switching their attention less frequently. So it really highlights the disruptive influence of email on our ability to concentrate.
Wow. And what about stress levels during that week?
So they were wearing heart rate monitors, and the physiological data showed that there were significantly lower stress levels by the end of the week for those who weren't using email.
I see.
And what's really interesting is the contrast in how participants described their experience.
Right.
When they were working with email, they were using terms like, it's ruining my life, it's interfering with my happiness. When they didn't have email, it was described as a freeing experience. They said, I felt liberated. I was working at a human pace, which actually became the title of their research paper.
A pace not dictated by electrons.
Yeah, it's a powerful statement.
That's really cool. And then there was a social element to this as well, wasn't there?
Yes, there was. So when email was unavailable, participants actually substituted those digital interactions with more face-to-face communication.
Really?
So even though they could have just picked up the phone, they actually chose to walk to their colleagues' offices, even to other buildings, just to have a conversation. And they reported actually enjoying those social interactions at work more.
Yeah.
Suggesting that, in some ways, email had replaced those direct human connections.
It had become this barrier almost.
Yeah.
So this brings us back to the Zagarnik effect that we were talking about.
Right.
And this idea of unfinished tasks. How does that relate to managing our attention in this digital world?
So, the Zagarnik effect, that tendency of our minds to kind of latch on to those tasks that haven't been completed, it creates this persistent mental tension.
Okay.
And as those unfinished tasks accumulate, this can actually drain our cognitive resources and contribute to that overall feeling of stress.
Right. So how do we combat that?
So Gloria Mark really emphasizes the value of externalizing our memory for these tasks.
Externalizing our memory, what does that mean?
So it means taking the information about that task and getting it out of our heads and recording it somewhere.
Okay.
So writing down notes, creating a voice memo, just outlining, what is the task? What's the priority? Where am I at? What are the next steps?
Okay.
And the key is to do this soon after the interruption occurs, or even, just during a planned break.
Yeah.
It helps to just offload that mental weight.
So your brain doesn't have to keep thinking about it.
Exactly. And there's actually a study that was done at Baylor University that kind of supports this idea.
Yeah.
They found that people who wrote down their unfinished tasks before going to bed fell asleep significantly faster than those who only wrote down completed tasks.
Really?
Yeah. And the more detailed those to-do lists of the unfinished tasks were, the quicker people fell asleep.
Wow.
So it really highlights that stress-reducing effect of kind of getting those things out of your head.
Yeah, so our minds are designed to keep track of those unfinished things, and then writing it down helps us let go.
Yeah, exactly.
Now let's switch gears a little bit and think about the internet itself.
Okay.
Because she talks about how the very design of the internet kind of contributes to our distracted attention.
It does. She actually draws a really interesting connection to Vannevar Bush,
Okay.
who decades ago had this concept of memex, which was this theoretical system that was designed to mirror the associative way that human memory works.
Okay.
So this aligns really nicely with something called semantic network theory, which basically suggests that our memories are structured as these interconnected concepts.
Right.
So if I say coffee, you might think of morning or energy or a particular coffee shop that you like.
Right.
And these associations, they actually help us to retrieve information more easily.
So is she saying that the internet structure is kind of like that?
Exactly. The internet with its hypermedia format, all those nodes and links, it essentially mirrors that associative structure of our brains.
I see.
So when you're on Wikipedia, for example, you're researching the Renaissance, you're immediately presented with links to related figures and artistic movements and geographical locations and all of that.
Yeah.
And, before the internet, following those associative trails would have been much more laborious.
Right. You'd have to go to the library.
Exactly. You'd have to go to the library.
Okay.
So it's much harder to kind of go down those rabbit holes.
So in a sense, the internet makes finding all this information really easy. Maybe too easy.
That's the double-edged sword, right? So this ease, while it's beneficial in many ways, it also unleashes these floodgates for distraction.
I see.
So the very structure that allows us to find information so quickly also makes it incredibly tempting to wander from one interesting tidbit to another.
So how do we counteract that then? How do we stop this mind wandering?
So she says that to really stop that kind of unhindered mind wandering online, we need three things. We need awareness.
All right.
So we need to be aware of what our online behavior is.
Okay.
We need motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to actually have a reason to want to change those patterns.
Yeah.
And then we need sufficient cognitive resources to resist those urges.
So you have to have the energy to actually do it.
Exactly. You have to have the willpower. And, those resources can be depleted by things like stress and lack of sleep.
Right. So you have to recognize it. You have to have a reason to change it. And you have to have the mental capacity to actually resist it.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's talk about the things that are actually out there vying for our attention, the algorithms and the targeted advertising.
Yeah, the invisible forces.
Yeah.
So this is really a huge factor that's shaping our attention landscape. And Gloria Mark explains that digital advertising is much more sophisticated than traditional media because it really capitalizes on the huge amounts of data that are being collected about our online behavior.
Right.
And the underlying patents for this type of targeted advertising, they go back decades.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they've really proliferated. And this mirrors, the explosion in digital ad spending,
Right.
which has reached truly astronomical figures.
Yeah, and it's so personalized.
It is so personalized, these algorithms. They analyze our online activity, what we buy, what websites we visit, what we read, and then they create these highly tailored advertisements, and it goes even deeper than that.
How so?
They actually use personality profiling.
Oh, wow.
So they're using our data to sort of infer, what are your personality traits?
Wow.
Like, are you high in neuroticism? Are you high in extroversion?
So then would someone who's neurotic see like certain types of ads and somebody who's extroverted would see different ads?
Exactly. So, for example, someone who's identified as having a higher level of neuroticism might see more advertisements for insurance or security systems.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right? Things that sort of appeal to that.
Yeah.
Whereas someone who's extroverted might be targeted with ads for social events or group activities.
I read a study about that, about the different slogans that were more effective for different personality types.
Yes, that's a great example of that research, how they can really tailor those messages to appeal to those underlying traits.
It's amazing.
And it's not just about products. Emotions are also really strategically employed to kind of capture our attention. And she even mentions how Facebook was weighting the angry reaction in their algorithm, recognizing that content that evoked these strong emotional responses tended to generate more engagement.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. If you think about it, if something makes you mad, you're more likely to comment on it, engage with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then you got platforms like TikTok,
Yeah,
which seem almost intentionally engineered to be addictive.
yeah. And she actually uses the example of a professional flutist named Rachel,
Okay.
who finds herself kind of drawn into TikTok during those moments of boredom or curiosity.
Okay.
And the algorithm really quickly learns her preferences. So it's feeding her this constant stream of, increasingly captivating content.
Wow.
The humor, the instant gratification of liking a video, all of these things reinforce that behavior of just continuous watching.
Like a reward system almost?
Yeah, it really is. And the laughter and the positive feelings that are generated from those engaging videos, they can actually trigger the release of these things called endogenous opioids.
Oh, wow.
Which are part of our brain's reward pathway. So it's further strengthening that desire to keep watching.
So they're not just passively presenting content, they're actually shaping our behavior in a way.
I think that's a great point.
And that brings up a lot of concerns about online privacy because, these algorithms can make connections that we don't really expect.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that's unsettling.
Yeah, and she gives examples of, the surprising friend recommendations you get on social media.
Yeah.
Where you're like, how did they connect those two people? And also the concerning example of the Grindr app actually suggesting a sex offender search app to their users.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and these really illustrate how algorithms can draw inferences and make connections that we just might not anticipate or find appropriate.
It's like a whole invisible world almost shaping our experiences.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's think about the social element, because we're social creatures.
We are.
And how does that affect our attention?
So our social needs and our social tendencies, they play a really significant role in how we use our devices and where we direct our attention online.
Okay.
And Gloria Mark discusses how early studies of virtual worlds actually revealed how powerful social norms are,
Okay.
even in digital environments.
Right.
So even without explicit rules, people naturally develop these conventions for behavior.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, things like email and Slack and Facebook, these are all social systems. And despite, the diversity of users, they establish these shared frameworks for communication, and they have these unwritten social conventions and expectations.
Like what?
So, the expectation of a timely email response, the social pressure to engage with content on social media. If someone posts something and you don't like it, they're like, hey, what's going on?
Yeah.
And our position within a social hierarchy can also influence our digital communication patterns.
So we're not just interacting with technology, we're interacting with each other through technology.
Exactly.
And that makes us susceptible to social influence.
Absolutely. And she actually points to Ash's conformity experiments.
Oh, yeah.
Where, people were shown a line and then they had to match it to one of 3 other lines. And it was really obvious which one was the right answer.
Right.
But when the other people in the group all gave the wrong answer, the participant often conformed and gave the wrong answer too.
Wow. Just because everybody else did it.
Yeah, the power of social influence.
Yeah.
And there was an interesting modern replication of this.
Okay.
Using robots.
Robots.
Yeah, so instead of having human confederates giving the wrong answer, they had robots giving the wrong answer.
And did people conform?
They didn't conform. So it raises questions about, online interactions where we don't always know.
Right. Is this a real person or is this a bot?
Exactly.
It's a good point.
Yeah. And then you have the pressure to keep up on social media.
Oh, yeah.
So there's that pressure to remain informed, to participate in discussions and the rewards we get, the likes and the shares and the comments.
Yeah, those little dopamine hits.
Yeah, they really do reinforce our attention to those platforms.
And even subtle cues like knowing someone's location can affect their influence over us.
Right. It taps into those in-group, out-group dynamics.
Okay.
So even just that little bit of information can make a difference. And then, there's this concept of Dunbar's number, which is that approximate limit on the number of stable social relationships we can maintain. And there's research suggesting that a similar constraint might exist for online relationships as well.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and Gloria Mark encourages us to be mindful of, the costs and benefits associated with the size of our online networks, and maybe a smaller, more curated network leads to more meaningful connections and requires